So, so I would like to talk a little bit about this relationship between language and culture, and the relationship between language learning and cultural learning. And my fundamental point is that the more we understand the way that the brain processes language, the more that we're understanding that language learning is itself a form of cultural learning, that language and culture are both complexly embodied patterns within us and in the world around us, and that understanding the cognitive processes related to language and culture learning can make us better educators and give us a clearer mental picture of what language and culture is. And so I just said this word mental picture, and that's what I'd like to start with. I'd like to talk a little bit about mental models. And by mental models, I mean the picture that we have in our mind of how we try to understand something. And here's a quote from Diane Larson Freeman, who talks about the way that our intuitive understanding of things is fundamentally metaphoric. And as researchers and as educators, every time we want to understand a complex phenomenon like language or language learning, we need to have some mental model to make sense of it. And fundamentally, the human mind is metaphoric. So we tend to have a metaphoric understanding of something. And when we put these metaphoric ideas and we develop them more, they start to function as a model or as a theory. So what I'd like to be talking about today is what is the mental model that we use when we think about language and when we think about culture? And can we have mental models that accurately reflect the way that language and culture function in our mind? So here's just one question. What images or metaphors come to mind when you hear the word language? So language is like X, or just in the chat window, what is the metaphoric feeling or image you have of language? I mean, there are many different ones, but just see what we come up with. Bridging from one mind to another. I love this. Food. The language is food. Language is culture, system. What a great set of answers. So a lot of these answers are the kinds of things that I feel in my experience of language. These things are like interaction, food, bridging from one mind to another, activity. But to say language is activity is rather abstract. I think among specialists, so here are some common metaphors that I hear people using when they talk about language. Language is a tool that you acquire. It's often talked about as a code or as an information system. We talk about language being processed. We sometimes talk about language in terms of like a mental bank where we store things, or that our memory is trained like a muscle. In applied linguistics and linguistics, language is often thought of as a system of symbols that are processed in some way. This is a quote by Steven Pinker. Take a look at these for a moment. These are, and I think this kind of way of looking at language is probably familiar to everyone. After all, if you say language is activity, the question is, how do we understand language? How do we study language? How do we study the learning of languages? And often the starting point has been something like this. Let's ask a different question. What images or metaphors come to mind when you hear the word culture? Wow, embodiment. So these are some very elaborated answers. People experience background, embodiment, diversity, a smaller group's particular way of celebrating, remembering, recreating, and consuming. So I did a Google image search of culture yesterday, and this is what I got. I think this is the way that a lot of people think about what culture is. You have kind of the culture as the exotic, culture as something exotic, some customs or objects, celebrations. How is culture talked about in language education? Often when I talk to a lot of language teachers, and a lot of language teachers talk to me and they'll say something like, well, you know, I'd like to include culture in my language education, but how can I fit culture into all the other things that I'm doing? And they're looking at culture as one aspect of language. So culture is something that tells you what to say when, or something that gives you the nuance of a particular word. That culture is a kind of aspect of language. So let me just stop sharing for a moment. So I have struggled when I've been talking with language-oriented people with these various images that we have of language and culture and language learning and cultural learning. And because for me, language learning has always been a deeply transformative experience, or I see it as a transformative experience. But traditional study of linguistics seems so far away from this traditional study of intercultural education or anthropology that this was also always a deep frustration for me. But what I found in recent years is that there has been research in the field of neurolinguistics and cognitive psychology and cultural psychology that I feel is really allowing us to bring language, our mental images of language and culture together in a way which wasn't possible before. And I would like to talk about that. And I'm referring to a body of research that relates to embodiment, embodied cognition, and research that's carried out in cognitive linguistics, in certain aspects of cognitive linguistics. And the research is finding that language, when it's processed by the mind, is not fundamentally a manipulation of symbols, but rather that our mind experiences linguistic meaning through a simulation or recreation of actual experience. So language, the processing of language is a creative process. People construct virtual experiences in their mind's eye. And what I found is that this view of language is very helpful in helping us understand better the relationship between language learning and cultural learning, and it can really inform the models, the mental models that we use when we think about them. Let me first give you a little bit of background. I'm curious, who is familiar with the Brain Dictionary project? Actually, I cannot see you. I need to change my view. Okay, so can you just raise your hand if you're familiar with the Brain Dictionary project? Okay, if you're not familiar with this, you have to check it out. They have put people in an fMRI and they've measured the activation patterns of their mind as people were reading stories. And what they were trying to do is map the location of particular words in the location of the brain that was activated. And they discovered a number of things. One thing they discovered is that language is not processed in a single language processing part of the brain, for example. There is no language processing part. Language is processed all around the brain, and it's processed in ways which are directly related to experience. What this means is, in the brain, there is no verb. There's no verb function in the brain. There is no definition in the brain. What there is semantic mapping related to lived experience. So we can see that language is processed all over the brain, but it's organized in a way which relates to experience. So look at these different categories of, this is the way the brain organizes language. So we have violence, social, time, outdoor, place. Why do we have these? Why is it organized this way? Because language is related to our lived experience that helps us survive in the world. In the same way that if we see someone fighting, we want to run away. We want to get away from there. Violence is an important thing for us to notice. We have a lot of processing that relates to that. One of the things that this means in a slightly more detail is that, for example, there isn't a single place for an individual word, that language is organized in terms of experience and not concepts. So the word top, for example, can be found in the part of the brain that processes clothing. So I'm wearing this top. It can be processed in the area that relates to numbers. So he has the top score. Or in the places for buildings and measurements. So I'm on the top floor. So the word top is not a concept in the brain. The word top is an experience. And this is what's meant by embodied simulation. And this is, I'm referring to the work of Benjamin Bergman, a neurolinguist. He was at UCSD, the last I knew. This is a quote of his: "Linguistic meaning does not simply consist of abstract concepts or symbols that are somehow stored in our brain. Instead, when we hear a word, our brain simulates the experience that is associated with that word." What does that mean? Let's look at an example. When I'm with my students, we often say this one together. Like, let's say this in our minds. You don't have to actually turn on your microphone, but let's have this conversation in our minds. My dog jumped over the pool. Wow, amazing. Not really. If I say dog to you, what is the image that comes to your mind? If you ask a group of people, you will get all kinds of different dogs that comes to people's minds. For one person, it's a German Shepherd. For another person, it's a Labrador. For another person, it's a poodle. Why is that? Because dog is not a concept. Dog is an experience. And if you have a Labrador, when I say dog, likely you'll think of a Labrador. So the words, my dog jumped over the pool, for one person might be a Chihuahua jumping over an Olympic-sized swimming pool. For another person, it might be a Dalmatian that's jumping over a kiddie pool. Language is a simulation of experience. Because of this, language is cultural, which means that language is a reflection of lived experience. So for example, if you say to a Japanese person, I had soup, are you referring to miso soup, or are you referring to soup that you eat with a spoon? Because in Japanese, there are two separate words for this. You would call this miso shiru. Shiru is a soup that you have in a bowl that you pick up with your hands. And it could be tonjiru, it could be miso shiru. But soup is a loan word from English, and the association is that you use a spoon. So in Japanese, do you eat soup or do you drink soup? Well, you drink shiru and you eat soup. Why is it? Why do we have those two different words for liquid food in Japanese? Because Western soup was introduced at the end of the 19th century, eating with a spoon together with other Western foods. And the experience of soup is different than the experience of shiru. So we have different words to describe the different experiences. So here, language being connected to experience, which also makes us understand how many ways in which language is cultural. So, how was your weekend? Well, Sunday was the 4th of July. Yes, it was. So we had hot dogs. Huh? Did you see any fireworks? Huh? What's the difference between the 4th of July and July 4th? The person on the left is not American. They don't know about the Independence Day celebrations that are held on the 4th of July. So if you ask how do you translate, for example, the 4th of July into Japanese, you could say Dokuritsu Kinenbi, the Independence Day, or you can say 7月4日, which is July 4th. Language is cultural because our lived experience is cultural. And if you grow up in North America, you become familiar with the associations of the 4th of July, of fireworks and hot dogs. If you do not grow up in the United States, the 4th of July may simply be the day after July 3rd. This connection that language is rooted in experience, and experience is, and culture is shared experience, is the language-culture connection. Language is rooted in, linguistic meaning is rooted, the experience of linguistic meaning, the process of linguistic meaning is rooted in experience, and experience comes from shared, culture comes from shared experience. We are understanding more about how the brain processes language. We're also understanding the ways that culture shapes the way that the mind works and cognitive processes. And let me just give you a couple of examples of this so that we can see some ways in which language and culture are coming together. Here's some that's me in the blue shirt, that's me on the left here, and that's me in the brown jacket. So in my family, we have a special code or a special phrase. My mother was never comfortable with the words "I love you" because she was a rather reserved person. So in my family, we always said 1, 2, 3. So when we would go off to school, she would say 1, 2, 3, see you tomorrow, see you later, 1, 2, 3. So language, in my family, this expression using 1, 2, 3 to mean I love you emerged from the interaction of my family members. And this became the culture of my family. And in this way, both language and culture reflect shared experience and a way of communicating that shared experience to other people within that body of speakers. This idea of language and culture emerging from the interaction, a meaningful interaction within a community of speakers, is the essential joining point of language and culture in terms of the way that the brain works. This idea of embodied cognition and embodied simulation has been studied in many different ways. I really recommend the book by Benjamin Bergman that now the title escapes me, Beyond Words, I think it's called. Here's just to give you a quick idea. What is she feeling? Is she feeling joy or is she feeling happiness? Well, it's hard to say what she's feeling. In one research project, they asked people in a bar to answer this question, and they asked people in a library. In the library, people more often said happiness. In the bar, people more often said joy. Can you guess why? This is heavy-duty linguistics research, man. I guess, how fun is that? Like to go into a library and ask people, show them a picture and ask them, is she feeling joy or is she feeling happiness? And then just have people say, by their gut reaction. Any guesses for why this is? Let's see. What's in the chat? Interesting. One is internal, one is social. Less inhibited at the bar. Not yet. Have we got any more? This is about language, how language is processed in the mind. This freaked me out when I found out this. Joy is group, happiness is individual. Getting a bit closer. If you like this stuff, you got to get the Benjamin Bergman book. It's full of stuff like this. Okay, here we go. Metaphorically, joy is a liquid. We're overflowing with joy. We're full of joy. We have an empty feeling. Happiness is an object, metaphorically speaking. We're in search of happiness. We find happiness. We share happiness. When we process abstract words like joy and happiness, we process them metaphorically. That's why we say, I've had it up to here. We say, let me look back on yesterday. Is the future in front of us or behind us? Well, in English, the future is in front of us. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. There are languages in which the future is behind us and we're moving backwards because we can see the past, but we cannot see the future. So we're moving backwards. Metaphoric understanding of language. Metaphor is everywhere in our understanding of language, and that's one way that we can understand the embodied aspects of language and language learning. So I highly recommend this book by Benjamin Bergman, which talks about embodied simulation. I have found it very, very useful for understanding the concept of linguaculture. That the notion of linguaculture, which you will find in the field of language and intercultural communication, is the idea that language and culture are part of a larger, complex, and embodied whole. And this is rooted in the idea that language is grounded in shared experience. So I've been talking about mental pictures. What is the mental picture of language? And what is the mental picture of culture? So what is a mental picture of, how can we make a mental picture of linguaculture? Well, I'll give you a couple of images that can contribute to the mental models that we use. Linguaculture can be seen, if we picture it like a tree with the shared experience of a cultural community, which gives us our intuitive understanding of what things mean and allows us to process language in a very fluent and intuitive way. Language itself is a series of patterns which is out in the world. It is both of the sounds and the structures that we can measure and experience. Sometimes people will say, yes, well, but English doesn't have a single culture. So how can you say that language and culture are one thing if, for example, English doesn't have a single culture? What about Jamaican English and South African English and Indian English? And well, English doesn't have a single culture, but English has many, 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 many people interacting using English. It's a vast ecosystem of interaction. To understand linguaculture as language and culture emerging, we also need to have a mental picture of the complexity of language. That language and culture emerge from interaction. And all of the English speakers all around the world interact in infinitely complex ways. And they are ecosystems that exist with different centers, and these are all in the same way that nature cannot, that a valley and a mountain are two separate things, but they are part of a larger whole, that a bay and an ocean are related, but they are separate. We can have different dialects, we can have different centers of language. Ultimately, because language emerges from interaction. And this notion of language emerging from interaction, who is familiar with the concept of an emergent property? Let's just raise your hand if you're familiar with the term emergent property. Okay, we've got a couple of people. Complexity theory, man, that's where it's at. Complexity theory talks about how interaction creates higher order phenomena. interaction creates higher order phenomena. So flock of birds, each bird has its own simple programming, but birds flying together create flocks. Ants have very simple programs, but when they interact together, they form a complex organism. Language and culture emerges from interaction. This relates to complexity theory, sometimes called dynamic systems theory. The idea being that a system is of interactive parts you cannot describe a complex system in cause and effect terms. How about this one? The butterfly effect. Have you heard of the butterfly effect? Okay, we know the butterfly effect. That's related to complexity, sometimes called chaos theory. And it relates to complex systems, cannot be described in terms of cause and effect, which is why linguists have such trouble pinning down the structure of language, because language is so complex in the way that it's processed that it's extremely difficult to create rules which can accurately reflect the way that language is used. And language changes in its use and in its interaction. So embodied simulation, the work of Benjamin Bergman, complexity theory, emergent properties, these are all really cool ideas that I have found very useful for understanding this relationship of language and culture as I'll just come back here, that language and culture as a complex embodied whole. Embodiment is another idea. I'd love to have another half an hour to talk about embodiment. Fundamentally, thought and feeling are not separate. Our usage of language, our decisions in everyday life, if you choose to buy Twinkies or ding-dongs or a tuna sandwich or a cheese sandwich, how do you make those decisions intuitively? Most of our life, we function on intuitive autopilot. So embodiment is another notion that is central to understanding this connection between language and culture. But let's go on to get back to our mental picture of language and culture learning. If we think of language and culture as linguaculture, then we have both linguistic patterns and cultural patterns. Now, is it possible to learn a language only by studying linguistic patterns? Well, it is. Some people learn Latin, a quote-unquote dead language. You can learn the structures of a language, but you will never function in that language in a living community. It requires experience to function in a living community. So what this means is learning a language implies learning to internalize both linguistic patterns and cultural patterns as part of a holistic process. And we know that you can have cultural experiences without learning much language, and you can learn linguistic patterns without learning many cultural patterns. There are a lot of implications to looking at language and cultural learning in this way. One of them is that if linguistic patterns are connected to cultural patterns, it means that language learning is necessarily an adaptive process. In other words, it's an invasion of the mind. In the same way that when we go to a foreign country, we have these foreign patterns which cause culture shock. When we try and learn a foreign language, we have it's psychologically exhausting, it's psychologically challenging to do that. We're having to arrange our thoughts in a different way. So that's what these circles at the top of this diagram are. Language learning as an adaptive process. It's taking in of foreign patterns. This means that it is disruptive. It is not simply a question of adding information to an information system. Language learning is disruptive. It disrupts the embodied cognitive patterns that we use every day. That's one reason that it's psychologically challenging as well as mentally challenging. So there's an integration process that goes on. This diagram is a diagram of the developmental model of linguaculture learning. And I'll just let you look at it for a moment. What do you think is represented on the bottom part of this data mapping systems and systems of systems? So in the chat window, what do you think that represents? What does your intuition tell you? So we've got some patterning, neural networks, neurological system, a whole lot of processing going on. Yeah, try and learn a foreign language. I tell you, you have a whole lot of processing going on when you're trying to learn a foreign language. Well, these are all correct. From catching attention to influencing perspective. So catching attention is a small point of something. Influencing perspective is a more embodied, holistic experience. So all of these are getting at this. This image comes from the work of Kurt Fischer, who was a cognitive educational psychologist, cognitive psychologist from dynamic skill theory. It represents the ways in which the brain processes information and learns complex skills. And the way that it works is, and this is a very simplified understanding, but to learn something new, the brain must make new networks of neurons. Neurons connect to each other. Those connections form networks. Those networks work together as a system. This happens in a specific order, and this means that new complex skills begin as separate individual skills. So if you're learning tennis, you learn a backhand, then you learn a serve, you learn a forehand. Then those bits of information or those individual skills need to be mapped together. So you start to map together the different bits of information or the different skills that you have so that you learn to serve and receive, you learn forehand and backhand. Then at a certain point, these disparate skills, these separate things that you've been mapping come together in a holistic way, such that you are no longer practicing tennis, you are playing tennis. So tennis exists as a system, and you are functioning within that system. So what you've gone from is individual bits of information to mapping of that information, to using that information as a holistic system. There is even more complex organization that you can go to. So if you're a tennis player, you know the tennis system. You can function in the tennis system intuitively. But that does not make you a tennis coach. To be a tennis coach, you need to understand a lot more than how to play tennis. You need different strategies, you need training techniques, you need to know physiology, you need to know sports psychology. So the system of systems level is the level at which multiple systems are joined together in a larger whole. So that's what this is describing here at the bottom, this data mapping systems and systems. And the assumption behind this model is, I think we can recognize these steps in our everyday life. And we can recognize it in language learning. Have you ever heard someone say something like this? Yeah, I speak Spanish. Una cerveza, por favor. So the cool thing about this person is that this person really thinks that he's speaking Spanish. Because for naive learners, knowing a few words or knowing some expressions is language learning. That's what the experience of language learning is, because that's the level at which they are processing learning. And this is the fundamental assumption of the development of this model, that as our cognitive systems get more complex, our experience of the phenomenon changes. Okay, so here's a quiz for you. We have 4 language learners, and we ask them, what do you have to do to be a good learner, good language learner? And we get 4 different answers. Juna says, to communicate better, I must learn many words. Vocabulary is key. Milpo says, I need to make perfect sentences. Burke says, I need to understand the learning processes and what works for me. Gilma says, when I practice English, I try not to worry about mistakes, just communicate. So notice that Milpo, for example, says you should try never to make mistakes. Gilma says, don't worry about mistakes. Who's the beginner, and who are the more beginning learners and who are the more advanced learners? So in the chat window, just put the JMBG in the order from beginner to advanced. And don't put send yet. Just put it in your chat window, and then I'll say, when I say go, I'll ask you to all put it together. So give it some thought for a minute. Okay. So let's see. If you have it, now let's send it into the chat window. So we have JMBG. Interesting. So we have a lot of J's at the beginning. A lot of people are saying that Juna, let's see, I'm losing somehow. There we go. Our answers are very similar. How did you know? Well, you have a feeling for this. You have a feeling for the ways in which learning a language goes from a simpler to a more complex state. And that is what the developmental model predicts. That as we learn a language, our experience of the language becomes more complex. And as it becomes more complex, the experience of language, the learning process changes, as well as the experience changes. And we know that when we first start learning a language, we learn how to pronounce individual words or sounds. We learn vocabulary words, we learn grammar rules. Then we go to an experimenting stage where we're trying to make sentences or trying to use a phrase in real life. And then there's this big leap to the third stage where we're integrating this into a more holistic system. And this is something that works not just for language, but for any complex skill, because this is the way that the brain organizes language. This is the way that the brain learns complex skills. I had hoped to finish by now, but I'm running a bit. I want to do one more thing because I want to make sure we have some time to talk. Can we do the same thing for culture? I know French culture. I saw the Eiffel Tower. We have a similar, and I'm not going to ask you to put it in the chat window just to save time, but just look at these and think for a moment about who is the naive cultural learner and who are the more advanced cultural learners. Knowing the facts and figures, that corresponds. So you learn culture as a fact. Culture as do's and don'ts of etiquette. What should I do? Should I hold my business card with 2 hands? When do I use tu? When do I use vous? Seeing things from a local perspective. That is when you're able to experience culture as an organic whole, as a holistic way of experiencing the world, so that you can have different cultural perspectives. And then, of course, if you have multiple cultural perspectives which you are managing, you are starting to understand a meta level, abstract understanding of culture and cultural difference. So in this way, I have found dynamic systems theory and the notion of embodiment to be very useful in understanding both language learning and cultural learning as a process of embodying foreign linguaculture patterns. And this model works both for language and cultural learning because it is grounded in the way that the brain processes language as an experience. I have written a whole book about this model, and I'll give you a free PDF if you want it. So if you have interest in this model, there'll be plenty of chance to learn more about it. So I won't force you to look at this diagram anymore, but I will say just a couple of things about some of the implications of this. One of the implications is that language learning is disruptive, psychologically disruptive, and this is an idea that is just beginning to be explored in second language learning, a notion of language resistance to language learning, because, and this is the assumption that language learning places psychological demands on the learner because it is imposed fundamentally, especially when language learning is required. It is psychologically demanding. There has been a model of, this has implications for motivation studies, and I'm involved with a research project sponsored by the Ministry of Education that is looking at resistance to language learning based on this understanding of language as an embodied, as a linguaculture, a process of linguaculture learning. And there's also an article that you can access that talks about this as well. We've been working on this particular model for 7 years. It's one of the applications of this linguaculture approach, looking at language and culture learning in this way. Another area that I'm working on, and this is the last thing I'll mention, I'm the co-host of the Deep Culture podcast, which is sponsored by the Japan Intercultural Institute. This is a completely non-commercial podcast. And this is fundamentally a podcast related to intercultural education and understanding. And it uses this embodied learning approach, basically cultural learning as an embodied, it's intercultural education that focuses on learner experience rather than abstractions about culture. And we have a materials development project. We have about 20 teachers that are working on developing materials to be used in intercultural education and language education, focused with intercultural understanding as a content. I'm happy to give you a free PDF of this book, which talks about this model in more detail than anybody wants to know. I can also give you a copy of today's slides. I can give you a copy of the article about resistance that I just referenced. I work with the Japan Intercultural Institute. We're an NPO, and this materials development process is sponsored by JII. So there's my email address. I will put that in the chat so you can have that. Also, I'd just be happy to hear from you. We do have a few minutes, so I want to put this in the chat, and I'm going to end here so we have at least a few minutes to talk. I know that I've kind of dumped a bunch of stuff on you, but I figured this group probably would get bored if you didn't have a lot of stuff to chew on. So I just threw it all at you, and hopefully something is of interest to you. So I would just like to open this up and invite any comments or questions or reactions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Shells. Let's all give him a round of applause. You can use your Zoom hands. It's a really intriguing talk, and I'll just give you all a moment if you'd like to raise your hands and ask a question. I'll call on you.
Or you can put something in the chat as well.
Yes. Oh, yes, go ahead, Dongping.
Not a question, just comments. Thank you so much, Dr. Schultz, to bring new ideas to us, to the students, and hopefully other people may look at the video in the future, even our faculty members. I think I'm the only faculty member here, right? Yeah, some of the students took my class. I teach eco-linguistics. So the aspect of embodiment, emergence, patterning, you can see the words I put in immediately come out from that context. So I see so much resonance there. And your solution of bringing embodiment through cultural learning is really very wise and highly relevant. The one thing I was just thinking, there are so many deep philosophical and psychological discussions here in terms of how we think language. The reason I put in language as activity, I think the idea is similar to embodiment, to see language as something that we do together where linguistic or semiotic resources play a part. So we don't see things like symbolic as abstract as it is remaining in our brain structure. So what you have shown us that our brain scan shows our language is stored as experiences, very similar to Dewey's claim of immediate empiricism. So everything is experienced as. That's very powerful metaphor for language learning. But one thing I saw at the end of the slides was you see all the arrows get into the learner. What did you use? The word you use as a overwhelming, right? When the learner is facing all these different obstacles, you call it what, deep something?
So yeah, the on that slide it said it's adaptive pressure. So this is
the pressure, yeah.
So this is a notion that comes from cultural adaptation, the notion of cultural adaptation, that when you're in a foreign environment, because the human mind is always sensitive to its environment and we're always interacting with our environment, when we're in a foreign environment, there is a psychological pressure to adjust to that gap, to the
psychological pressure. Yeah.
And so it's a
yeah.
I'm sorry, it's the psychological pressure of encountering foreignness fundamentally.
Right.
And so when we're trying to pronounce the sounds of a foreign language, we're doing more than trying to manipulate our tongues and mouths. We are having to change the way that we use our body to experience language in the world. And so it's not a psychologically neutral point is really what this
Right.
diagram is trying to get at.
Right, exactly. So what I'm just thinking aloud with you, based on that psychological facts, what can we do to use our experiences, our social cultural encounters to unburden that psychological encountering? So from the ecological psychology point of view, we turn persons into agent who has the active control of what is going on in the world, including symbolic information. So since Japan, you were working in the context of Japan, so I'm curious, what are some of the solutions that you have based on this model?
So a couple of things. One is that good language teaching, all good language teaching involved teaches language as a living thing, not as something that's dead in a dictionary. So language as a living thing, there are many things that you can do to make language alive, whether it's interaction in the classroom, whether it's peer role models, or many things which are good language teaching practice work. Specifically though, the brain's motivation system, we have both approach motivation and avoidance motivation. They're two separate processes in the mind.
Right.
So what we're calling, for example, students, if we say, oh, my students are not motivated, this model predicts that it's not that they're not motivated. It is that resistance is an active state. That the first step is to lower resistance and increase engagement. So to think of motivation in terms of resistance and engagement, so that this, in order to empower people or to give people autonomy, to give them self-efficacy, the first thing they need is security. And they need the security to know where they stand and what they should do and how they can proceed and how they can make progress and whether they're doing a good job or not. So to think of the psychology of learning in terms of not simply motivation, but in terms of resistance and engagement is one of the areas that I have been pursuing specifically to try and answer this question of what are the implications of this. And this was the article that I referenced. So I think another answer is that we know that good language teaching does those kinds of things. If you're memorized, yeah.
I think Ricky has a really good point there in the chat.
Is all learning disruptive? The degree to which, so it's disruptive to the degree to which it forces us to do something different than what we're used to doing. So anything that we have already learned that we have to learn to do in a different way is disruptive. We already use language. We have already embodied language very deeply. So it's disruptive in the sense that it requires a change. But if you've never done any dancing and you start to learn ballroom dancing, it's not disruptive. But if you do jazz dance and then you try to learn ballroom dancing, you probably have to unlearn or get things disrupted. Is disruptive equal to... Yes, go ahead. You wanted to comment there?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. If we see language as an experience compared to the language as an object, language as a symbolic model, then language learning may not be disruptive. It will be really fun if we create a rich environments for us to be playful, to be joyful.
And I think this is a really important point, that foreignness can attract us and foreignness can make us resist. And when foreignness attracts us, it's exactly like you say. So we become engaged. That's engagement. You hear someone, they heard a song in a foreign language and this triggered their interest, and then they learned the language. They got very dedicated to learning the language because they were fascinated with it. This is foreignness as a positive, foreignness as something that engages us, that we appreciate the process. But foreignness can have the opposite effect as well. It can make us put on the brakes. So I think your point is exactly right. How do we take language learning towards this engagement, to a positive engagement with what is new and different, disruptive in a good way? Because disruption can be great.
That's a challenge. Mm-hmm.
That's why we go on vacation.
Exactly.
We go on vacation because we want to be disrupted. So disruption can be good. Is disruptive equal to violence? Well, we did a study of 1,500 Japanese college students, and 20% of them said that they had been traumatized by English language learning in school. And that is because they've spent 6 or more years being required to sit in a classroom and do things which felt alien to them. And there's a psychological impact. If you've ever talked to someone who has quote unquote failed at learning a language, they never want to try again. So disruption is violent, psychologically violent, when it is imposed. So, it can be considered that way. So the issue, though, is that language learning is hard. It's extremely difficult. And so the solution is better language education. It's not to, I don't believe that foreign language learning is damaging psychologically in general. I do not subscribe to the idea that, for example, someone in Japan learning English is a form of colonialism. I don't subscribe to that idea. Language learning is an empowering thing for the people who are doing it. So for me, the solution is better language education and a better understanding of the psychological power of language and cultural learning. I've used up my time. I would love to hang out with everyone, and I'm sure that there are things going on in people's minds that would be great to hear about, but I guess we just are running out of time. I just want to thank you so much. I'd be happy to hear from anyone who'd like to follow up on anything we talked about today.